They say you never really know someone until you see them at their worst. I thought I knew my daughter-in-law until the day she changed the locks on my own front door. For 37 years, I had lived in that house. I had scrubbed every inch of those hardwood floors on my hands and knees, painted every wall twice over, and planted the rose bushes that now bloomed magnificently each spring. When my husband passed 5 years ago, the house felt too big, too quiet, but it was still mine. It held our memories in every creaking floorboard and faded wallpaper pattern. My son had always been a gentle soul. Perhaps too gentle. Even as a child, he would apologize for things that weren't his fault, seeking approval from everyone around him. When he married her 3 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. She was beautiful, ambitious, and seemed to love him deeply. What mother wouldn't want that for her son? The changes started small. She would rearrange my kitchen when she visited, claiming she was just trying to help make things more efficient. She would comment on my clothing choices, suggesting I might look more modern in different styles. She had opinions about everything from the way I kept my garden to the programs I watched on television. My son would smile nervously during these moments, his eyes darting between us like a child caught between arguing parents. When they moved in temporarily after losing their apartment lease, I told myself it would be good to have company again. The house had felt so empty since my husband died. I gave them the master bedroom and moved my things to the smaller guest room. It was supposed to be for just a few months while they saved money for a down payment on their own place. Those few months stretched into a year, then 2. She began treating my home like her domain, making decisions about everything from the thermostat setting to which flowers should be planted in my garden. She would invite her friends over without asking, hosting dinner parties in my dining room while I retreated to my small bedroom to avoid the noise and chaos. My son seemed to shrink more each day. The confident young man who had once called me every Sunday to check on me became quiet and distant. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would just say she was stressed about money and that I should be more understanding. He was working 2 jobs to support them both, since she had quit her position at the marketing firm, claiming the work environment was toxic. The financial arrangements became increasingly uncomfortable. They contributed nothing toward utilities or groceries. Yet she would leave lights blazing throughout the house and run the air conditioning at levels that made my monthly bills triple. When I gently mentioned this, she would roll her eyes and tell my son that I was being petty about money. He would slip me a $20 or $40 with an apologetic look, as if that covered the hundreds of dollars in additional expenses each month. She started making comments about the house itself, how outdated everything looked, how much potential it had, if only someone would invest in proper renovations. She would show me pictures on her phone of house-flipping shows, pointing out how much money people made by updating old properties. The way she said old always felt like a personal attack. Then came the suggestions about assisted living communities. She would leave brochures lying around the kitchen counter, highlighting features like 24-hour nursing care and organized social activities. When I would throw them away, new ones would appear the next day. She started talking about how nice it would be for me to have people my own age to spend time with, how I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a big house anymore. My son began avoiding eye contact when these conversations happened. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with what seemed like pity, and my heart would break a little more each time. The boy who used to build blanket forts with me in the living room now acted as though I was a burden he didn't know how to handle. The isolation crept in gradually. My old friends stopped calling as often, partly because she would answer the phone and tell them I was resting or too busy to talk. My weekly bridge games became monthly, then stopped altogether when she scheduled appointments or errands during those times. She always had a reasonable explanation, but the pattern was clear to anyone who cared to see it. I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, afraid to make noise in the kitchen early in the morning, reluctant to watch my television programs when she might find them annoying. I started spending more time in my small bedroom, reading books I had already read multiple times and looking through photo albums of happier days. The morning everything changed started like any other. I had gotten up early to water my roses before the sun became too intense. The garden had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I felt completely myself. As I stood among the blooms my husband and I had planted together, I heard raised voices coming from the kitchen window. She was on the phone with someone, her voice sharp with irritation. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her words carried clearly through the morning air. She was complaining about having to live with an old woman who didn't appreciate how much they were helping her. She talked about me like I was a difficult child, rather than the woman who owned the house she was living in rent-free. But it was what she said next that made my blood run cold. She was discussing me with what sounded like someone from a real estate office, talking about the property value and how much the house would be worth if it were properly staged and marketed. She mentioned that I was getting more forgetful lately, that my son was concerned about my ability to manage my own affairs. None of this was true. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I balanced my own checkbook, remembered every birthday and anniversary, and could still beat anyone at crossword puzzles. But I realized she was building a narrative, creating a story that would justify whatever they were planning. I stood frozen among my roses, the garden hose still running in my hand, as the full scope of what was happening became clear. This wasn't just about convenience or saving money. This was about my house, my independence, my entire life. That afternoon, I made an excuse about needing to visit the bank and drove to the office of the attorney who had handled my husband's estate. The receptionist recognized me and squeezed me in between appointments. I sat in the familiar chair across from his mahogany desk and tried to find the words to explain what I suspected was happening. He listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the financial arrangements and living situation. When I mentioned the real estate conversation I had overheard, his expression grew serious. He explained that elder abuse often begins subtly, with family members gradually taking control of an older person's resources and decision-making authority. He recommended that I immediately secure all my important documents and financial information. He suggested I might want to consider changing my will and power of attorney arrangements if my son was currently designated to make decisions on my behalf, should I become incapacitated. The conversation was sobering but necessary. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to process everything I had learned. My son came home from work looking exhausted. His shoulders slumped with the weight of whatever burdens he was carrying. For a moment, I felt a surge of maternal protectiveness. Then she walked into the room and the dynamic shifted immediately. She was in an unusually good mood, chattering about her day and making plans for the weekend. She mentioned that she had spoken to someone about getting estimates for updating the kitchen and bathrooms. When I asked who had authorized these consultations, she smiled sweetly and said she was just exploring options to help increase the value of the property. The word she used was interesting. Property. Not home. Not my house. Property. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge that these were decisions I should be involved in making. Instead, he mumbled something about how updates might be a good investment and disappeared into their bedroom. I sat alone at my kitchen table feeling like a stranger in my own home. The next few weeks passed in a haze of contractors stopping by to assess various renovation projects. She would schedule these visits during the day while my son was at work, presenting herself as the homeowner and discussing changes as though they were already decided. When I tried to participate in these conversations, she would politely but firmly redirect the discussion, treating me like an elderly relative who didn't quite understand modern home improvement concepts. I started documenting everything. I wrote down dates and times when contractors visited, kept copies of any paperwork I found lying around, and began paying closer attention to their whispered conversations behind closed doors. The attorney had advised me to gather evidence if I suspected manipulation or fraud. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early fall. I had been in the garden deadheading my chrysanthemums when I heard the doorbell ring. Through the front window, I could see a woman in a business suit with a clipboard standing on my porch. She approached the door with confidence, clearly expecting to be welcomed inside. I opened the door to find a real estate agent introducing herself and asking if this was a convenient time to do the preliminary assessment we had discussed. She seemed surprised when I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. The confusion lasted only a moment before she checked her notes and confirmed she was indeed at the correct address. She explained that she had been contacted about potentially listing the property and had been told that the family was considering selling due to health concerns and the difficulty of maintaining such a large home. She had been led to believe that I was eager to downsize and move to a more manageable living situation. I stood in my doorway, looking at this well-meaning woman who had been fed a complete fabrication about my circumstances and desires. The audacity of it took my breath away. Not only were they planning to sell my house without my knowledge, but they had already begun the process. I politely told the agent there had been a misunderstanding and that the house was not for sale. Her confusion was evident as she checked her paperwork again. She mentioned that she had been told to expect some resistance due to my attachment to the property, but that my family was confident we could work through any concerns. After she left, I sat in my living room staring at the family photos on the mantelpiece. Pictures of my son as a baby, as a young boy learning to ride his bike in the front yard, as a teenager graduating from high school. Photos of his wedding day, where he looked so happy and hopeful. I wondered when exactly I had stopped being his mother and become his problem. That evening, I made dinner as usual, setting 3 places at the table and preparing their favorite meal. We ate mostly in silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, as she was clearing the dishes, I mentioned that a real estate agent had stopped by unexpectedly. The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly. She explained that she had just been exploring options, getting information about the current market in case I ever decided I might want to sell. She said it was just preliminary research, nothing more. My son looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I realized that his silence was its own form of betrayal. He knew what was happening and was choosing to go along with it rather than stand up for me. I excused myself and went to my bedroom, where I called the attorney's office and left a message explaining what had happened. I also called my sister, who lived 2 states away but had always been my closest confidant. I hadn't wanted to burden her with my problems, but I needed someone in my corner who remembered who I used to be before I became invisible in my own home. My sister was furious when I told her everything. She had never particularly liked my daughter-in-law, finding her manipulative and self-centered. But she had kept her opinions to herself for the sake of family harmony. Now she wished she had spoken up sooner. She drove down that weekend, and her presence changed the entire dynamic in the house. Suddenly, there was another witness to the subtle put-downs and dismissive behavior I had been enduring. My sister watched with sharp eyes as my space was invaded and my opinions were brushed aside. She saw how I had been diminished in my own home. On Sunday morning, while my son and his wife were still sleeping, my sister and I sat in the kitchen over coffee and made a plan. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about reclaiming my life and my dignity before it was too late. The first step was securing my finances. That Monday, I went to the bank and moved most of my savings to a new account at a different institution. I updated my will and power of attorney documents, removing my son as the designated decision-maker and appointing my sister instead. I also changed the locks on my house and had new keys made, keeping one set for myself and giving the spare to my sister. When they returned home that evening to find they couldn't get in, the explosion was immediate and dramatic. She pounded on the door, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. She accused me of being spiteful and vindictive, of punishing them for trying to help me. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Standing on my own threshold, I felt stronger than I had in years. I told them calmly that I had discovered their plans to sell my house without my consent, and that I could no longer trust them to live in my home. My son finally found his voice, but it was to protest that they had nowhere else to go, that they couldn't afford their own place yet. He pleaded with me to reconsider, promising that things would be different if I would just give them another chance. Looking at his face, I felt a deep sadness for the man he had become and the relationship we had lost. But I also felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about punishment. This was about survival. I told them they had until the end of the week to find alternative arrangements. I offered to help them financially with a security deposit if they found a reasonable apartment, but they could no longer live in my house. The boundary was firm and non-negotiable. She called me names I won't repeat and stormed off to their car. My son lingered on the porch, looking lost and defeated. For just a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run to me when he was hurt or scared. But then he turned and followed her without another word. They found a small apartment across town and moved out within a week. The silence in my house felt different now. Instead of the oppressive quiet of walking on eggshells, it was the peaceful silence of sanctuary. I could breathe again. The months that followed weren't easy. My son called occasionally, always asking when he could come home, when I would forgive them and let them move back. She had apparently convinced him that I was having some sort of mental breakdown, that my actions were irrational and cruel. I maintained my boundaries while leaving the door open for a genuine relationship built on mutual respect. I told him I loved him and always would, but that I couldn't allow myself to be manipulated or taken advantage of anymore. If he wanted to be part of my life, it would have to be on terms that honored both of us. She made several attempts to end run around my decision. She showed up at my door with elaborate apologies and promises to change. She enlisted mutual friends to intercede on their behalf, painting me as a stubborn old woman who was tearing the family apart over petty grievances. But I had learned something important about myself during those difficult months. I discovered that I was stronger than I had ever realized. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space was learning to take up exactly as much space as she deserved. I started attending a support group for seniors who had experienced family manipulation. Hearing other people's stories helped me understand that what I had experienced was more common than I had realized. I wasn't crazy or selfish for protecting myself. I was simply learning, perhaps later than I should have, how to set healthy boundaries. My garden became more beautiful than it had ever been. Without someone constantly criticizing my plant choices or trying to reshape my vision, I was free to create the space I had always dreamed of. I planted new varieties of roses, installed a small fountain, and created a reading nook where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the sunrise. I also started volunteering at the local library, helping with their literacy program for adults. Having a purpose outside of my family relationships reminded me that I had value beyond my role as mother and homemaker. The students I worked with appreciated my patience and knowledge, and their gratitude filled a space in my heart I hadn't realized was empty. Nearly a year after I had changed the locks, my son came to visit alone. His wife was visiting her own family, he said, and he wanted to talk. We sat in my living room, the afternoon light streaming through windows that I no longer had to keep closed for privacy in my own home. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. He told me that their marriage was struggling, that the financial stress of supporting themselves had created tension between them. He admitted that he had been wrong to go along with her plans without discussing them with me first. I listened without offering advice or trying to fix his problems. That was something else I had learned in the support group. I could love my adult children without taking responsibility for their choices or their consequences. He asked if he could start visiting regularly, just the two of us, to rebuild our relationship. I told him I would welcome that, but that it couldn't include discussions about her moving back or returning to the previous arrangement. Some boundaries, once established, needed to remain firm. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt our connection. We had dinner together once a week, and he helped me with small projects around the house. We talked about his childhood, about his father, about dreams and disappointments. Gradually, I began to see glimpses of the son I remembered, the one who had existed before he became someone else's shadow. Their marriage didn't survive the changes. Once she realized that reconciliation wasn't going to restore her access to free housing and financial support, she filed for divorce. My son was devastated but not entirely surprised. He had known for some time that their relationship was built on unstable ground. During the divorce proceedings, some uncomfortable truths came to light. She had been maintaining credit cards in my son's name that he didn't know about. She had also been in contact with several other real estate agents, not just the one who had appeared at my door. The scope of her plans had been larger than any of us had realized. My son apologized repeatedly for his role in what had happened. I accepted his apologies, but I also made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt slowly and with consistent actions over time. Today, 3 years later, my son and I have a relationship that is healthier than it ever was before. We respect each other's independence while maintaining the love and connection that binds us as family. He has learned to make his own decisions rather than being swayed by manipulative partners, and I have learned that being a good mother sometimes means saying no. My house remains my sanctuary. I've made some updates over the years, but they were changes I wanted, made on my timeline and with my resources. The roses in my garden bloom more magnificently each year, and I've added a small vegetable plot that keeps me busy during the growing season. I still attend the support group, though now I often serve as a mentor to newer members who are just beginning to recognize manipulation in their own families. My story gives them hope that it's never too late to reclaim your power and rebuild your life on your own terms. The most important lesson I learned through this experience is that love without respect isn't really love at all. Real love honors the dignity and autonomy of the other person. It doesn't seek to control or diminish or manipulate. When I stopped accepting treatment that diminished me, I didn't lose love. I made space for real love to grow. Sometimes people ask if I ever regret my decision to change those locks, to force that confrontation that changed everything. The answer is no. That moment of standing firm in my own doorway was the beginning of standing firm in my own life. It was the day I stopped being afraid of taking up space and started insisting on being seen. I am 72 years old, and I am finally, fully myself. My home is my own. My decisions are my own. My future is my own to shape. And every morning when I walk among my roses with my coffee in hand, I am grateful for the courage I found to reclaim what was always mine.